It was late afternoon, and I was cleaning my bedroom when I heard the door creak behind me. I turned to find Alden standing in the doorway, staring at the thing in my hands. My heart stopped. How could I explain this? The object was anything but innocent. A large, brightly coloured, toy. One that no polite conversation could avoid. I had taken it out of the drawer to dust the back of the cupboard, not thinking much of it. I had locked the door, or so I thought. Alden was my 23-year-old stepson. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked in a local brewery and usually stayed out late with friends after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his amused blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his voice somewhere between curious and teasing. My face flushed. I dropped the object as if it had burned me and grabbed the first thing I could find, a pillow from the bed, to cover it. "It's none of your business," I stammered, feeling my throat tighten. But his expression didn't change. If anything, he leaned against the doorframe, his curiosity growing. You don't have to act so embarrassed," he said with a small grin. "It's not like I haven't seen this before." I felt like crawling into a hole. The audacity of this boy, man really, to stand there so nonchalantly, completely unaffected, while my world spun out of control. I forced a laugh, desperate to deflect the attention. "Alden, seriously, mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't move. For a moment, there was a silence between us, heavy and almost unbearable. He wasn't looking at the pillow in my hands, he was looking at me. His look was different, not the usual relaxed or playful look I was used to. This one stayed too long, too intense. It was as if he'd peeled back a layer of the person he thought I was and found someone else entirely. I felt something strange, a flicker of warmth deep in my chest, followed by a sharp pang of guilt. This was wrong. Whatever it was absolutely wrong. I was his stepmother, for Christ's sake. I was married to his father. I shook my head, breaking the silence. "Please, Alden, just go." He finally shrugged and raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, his tone light again. But before he left, he gave me one last look, a look that sent my already troubled thoughts into overdrive. As the door closed behind him, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the pillow still pressed against my chest. My heart was racing. I couldn't even bring myself to put it back in the drawer. It felt like something invisible had shifted in the air between us. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I'd never see Alden the same way again. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't get that moment out of my head. I tried. I cooked dinner, folded the laundry, and even sat next to Victor on the couch as he flicked through old westerns on the television. But Alden's face, that amused grin and that unsettling glint in his eyes, haunted me. Victor barely noticed my distraction. That was nothing new. He'd been wrapped up in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, for years, ever since he retired. I didn't blame him, that would have been too easy, but sometimes I felt more like a caretaker than a wife. Once I looked down the hall and caught Alden's shadow as he moved about his room. I could hear the faint hum of music coming through his door, a low bass line that didn't match the quiet stillness of the rest of the house. My heart leapt for no reason I could explain, and I turned my attention back to my husband. Victor was snoring softly, his chin tucked into his chest. He'd fallen back asleep in his armchair, the TV still blaring. I thought about waking him, but what would be the point? Instead, I got up and went to the kitchen, grateful for a moment of solitude. But I wasn't alone for long. Alden walked in, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair dishevelled as if he'd just run his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, keeping my tone light. He smiled and leaned against the counter. "Just relaxing, you know. It's not easy being under this roof sometimes." The comment made me stop. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but there was a hint of something serious in his expression. It's nothing, just living here again, I guess. I feel like I don't fit in anymore. I softened at that. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of maternal concern. It's only temporary, Alden. You'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll bounce back. Thank you, Melina, he said, his voice softer now. I appreciate it. We stood in silence for a moment. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking, though neither of us moved. His eyes lingered on mine, and I felt that same flicker of warmth in my chest again. I cleared my throat and busied myself wiping the counter, desperate to break the spell that was threatening to take hold. But Alden wasn't finished. About earlier, he began, his tone becoming playful again. You don't have to be embarrassed, you know. I mean, we're all human, right? My hand froze in mid-wipe, and I turned to him, trying to keep my composure. Alden, let's not talk about it, shall we? It was an accident, and it's not worth bringing up again. Okay, he said, raising his hands in surrender, but there was a teasing edge to his smile that made my stomach turn. He walked past me, close enough for me to catch a whiff of his cologne. I didn't turn around, but I could feel his presence behind me for a moment before he finally left the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Victor, my mind raced. What was happening to me, to us, to this house? I'd always been able to draw clear lines, lines that weren't meant to be crossed, but Alden had a way of bending those lines, even when he didn't mean to. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning I tried to act normal. I made breakfast as usual, eggs, toast and coffee for Victor, a smoothie for myself. Alden was the last to enter the kitchen, as usual, his hair still damp from a shower. He greeted Victor with a casual "morning" and me with a warm smile that made my pulse quicken. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and occasional snippets of conversation filling the air. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension. Every time Alden's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled the coffee, it felt deliberate. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Victor, of course, noticed nothing. After breakfast, Alden offered to help me tidy up. Normally he would have disappeared into his room or out with his friends, so his offer took me by surprise. You don't have to, I said, stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, already grabbing a dishcloth. We worked in silence for a while, but the air between us felt charged. At one point I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands collided. Neither of us immediately pulled away. You're different, he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. What do you mean? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know, you don't act like other women your age. I laughed nervously, stepping back to get some distance. Well, that's flattering, I suppose. It's not just that, he continued, his tone now serious. You're real. You actually listen. You see people. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I felt his presence close behind me. My heart was racing again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could collect my thoughts, Victor's voice called from the living room. Melina, where's my crossword book? The moment shattered, and Alden stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. I'll leave you to it, he said, his voice light again. As he walked away, I felt a mixture of relief and longing. I knew I was playing with fire, but part of me couldn't help but reach for the warmth. I spent that afternoon running errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But when I returned home, I found Alden sitting on the porch steps, staring out into the garden. He looked lost in thought, a far cry from the confident young man I was used to seeing. Hey, I said quietly as I approached. He looked up, his face breaking into a small smile. Hey, everything okay? He hesitated before answering. Yeah, just thinking. About what? About life, I guess. where I'm going, where I should be going. I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. "You're young, Alden. You don't have to have it all figured out yet." "Maybe," he said, his eyes still on the courtyard. Then, after a pause, he added, Do you ever feel like you're meant for something else? Like you're trapped in the wrong story?" His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be all right, but the truth was that I didn't believe it either. Instead, I put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it gently. "You're not trapped," I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment, he covered my hand with his, and the gesture felt impossibly intimate. I quickly pulled away, but the damage was done. Another line had been crossed, another boundary blurred, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it. That evening, the sky darkened with a gathering storm. The air hung heavy, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Victor had gone to bed early, as he often did, complaining of a sore shoulder. I had settled down in the living room with a book in my hand, but I couldn't concentrate. The storm outside mirrored the one building inside me, something restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Alden was in the kitchen, the sound of the fridge opening and closing carried through the quiet house. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, 2 glasses in hand. "Whiskey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, surprised. I don't usually drink this late. "Well, tonight might be an exception," he said with a grin, handing me a glass without waiting for an answer. I hesitated, but took it, the cool glass pressing against my palm. Alden sank into the chair opposite me, his legs stretched out nonchalantly. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow over his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding towards the book on my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting?" he grinned. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly and took a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while we sat in comfortable silence, the storm outside growing louder. But then he spoke again, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" I looked at him wearily. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as if gathering his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question startled me. It was eerily similar to the one he'd asked earlier on the veranda, but now it carried a different weight. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice lower than I had intended. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." I felt my cheeks flush and looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Alden, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not? It's true." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. "I think it's time to call it a day," I said, avoiding his gaze. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorientating, and I froze in my tracks. "Oh," I murmured, my voice shaking. "It's just the storm," Alden said, his tone calm. I heard him stand up, the soft shuffling of his feet on the carpet. "Hang on, I'll find a torch." I heard him come closer, the soft rustle of fabric as he passed me. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and I drew in a sharp breath. "Sorry," he murmured. But he didn't pull away. His hand lingered, warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Melina," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned towards him, though I couldn't see him in the darkness. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, his steady breathing. And then his hand slid up to my wrist and held it gently. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," he replied. But he didn't let go. The first flash of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment I saw his face, serious, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to push him away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt, as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When the lights flickered back on, we pulled apart, both of us breathing hard. The reality of what we had just done hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands shaking. "This can't be happening," I said, shaking my head. "Alden!" He didn't argue, he just stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said again, his voice calm. But the damage was done. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Alden as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine, or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the spare bedroom, Alden appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I sighed and set the laundry down, finally meeting his gaze. "Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You don't understand. If Victor ever found out—" "He won't," Alden interrupted. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words stung, partly because they were true, but that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising. "It's about us. About the fact that this, whatever this is, can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible." Alden took a step closer, his eyes locked with mine. "Why? Because you're afraid of what people will think? Because you're afraid of what they might think?" I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. "Melina," he continued, his voice softer now, "I don't want to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either." I felt tears tugging at the corners of my eyes and looked away. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead I shook my head, pushed past him, and left the room without another word. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle hum of Victor's breathing beside me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, none of which I could untangle. At some point I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water would help calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Alden's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the frame as if he'd been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a low voice. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and charged. And then, without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever it was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us, it wasn't going to go away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there wasn't a storm to blame, or a flickering light to hide behind. This time it was intentional. It started in the laundry room, of all places. I was taking warm towels out of the dryer, the mundane rhythm of folding them offering a kind of escape. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "Do you always work?" Alden said, his voice light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough, But don't you ever get tired of it? Tired of what? Looking after everything, taking care of everyone. When's the last time someone looked after you? His words cut me like a knife. I turned around, clutching a folded towel to my chest like a shield. Alden, I don't think we should be having this conversation. Why not? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, so untroubled, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, searching, and incredibly focused on me. Because, I said, my voice faltering, it's not appropriate. Appropriate, he repeated, as if testing the word. But that's not the same as honest, is it? I wanted to argue, to shut him up before he could say anything else that would make this worse. But before I could, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. You don't have to pretend with me, Melina, he said quietly. I see you. I see the way you carry this house, the way you hold everything together when everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself? My throat tightened and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter against my hips. Alden, this, whatever this is, it has to stop. Then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. Tell me you don't feel it too, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time I didn't stop him. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful. Or so we thought. Alden was good at finding excuses to be in the same room as me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cupboard door, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first it was exciting, the thrill of something forbidden, but the reality of our situation weighed heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. One afternoon, as I was putting the shopping away, Alden came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened and glanced towards the door to make sure no one was there. Alden, I hissed, trying to pull away. Victor could walk in any minute. He's in the hardware store, Alden said, his voice calm. Relax. But I couldn't relax. Not anymore. The paranoia was beginning to eat away at me. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Bethany, our nosy neighbour, waved at me from across the road, I felt like she could see right through me. We need to talk, I said, turning to Alden. About what? He asked, his expression unreadable. About this, about us. His jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. What about us? This has to stop, I said, forcing the words out. It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor. Fair to Victor, he repeated, his voice rising. What about fair for you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want. What I want doesn't matter, I snapped. It's not about me. It is, Alden shot back. You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you. The words hung in the air, heavy and relentless. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't because deep down I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Victor had invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner, and I did my best to play the part of the perfect hostess. But Bethany's sharp eyes seemed to be on me all night, and I couldn't help feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Bethany cornered me. You've been awfully distracted lately, she said, her tone casual, but her eyes probing. Just busy, I replied, forcing a smile. You know how it is. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Does Victor know? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Know what? She shrugged, her expression unreadable. Whatever's going on with you and Alden, I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaking. Bethany smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Just be careful, Melina. Secrets have a way of getting out. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Bethany's words in my head. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Alden found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, coming closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing up and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Bethany knows, Alden. She knows." He frowned, his expression darkening. "How could she know?" "I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Victor, she won't," he said firmly. "You don't know that," I snapped. "You don't understand how dangerous this is." Alden took my hand, his grip strong but not painful. "What I do understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice surprised me, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we must be careful, for both our sakes." The days that followed were tense. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least not that I knew of, but the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a cloud. Alden tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more nervous than usual. Then, one evening, Victor came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Alden, the two of us standing closer than we should have been, when we heard the front door open. We jumped apart like guilty teenagers. "Victor!" I called, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Victor appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. For a moment I thought he was going to say something, but then he just nodded. "Dinner ready?" "Almost," I said quickly. He left without another word, but the look he gave me stayed with me long after he was gone. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Victor's eyes had lingered on me just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever it was between Alden and me, it felt too big, too consuming, to just walk away. But deep down I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. It started when Victor came home unexpectedly early, but this time it wasn't just the timing that surprised me. His face was set, his expression unreadable, as he entered the house and set down his briefcase with a deliberate thud. "Alden!" Victor called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Alden appeared in the hallway moments later, his casual demeanor contrasting with Victor's obvious tension. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. Victor's eyes narrowed. "We need to talk, now." The tone of his voice left no room for argument. Alden glanced at me briefly, concern flickering in his eyes, before following Victor into the living room. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding. At first I couldn't hear their words, just the deep rumble of Victor's voice and the occasional softer response from Alden. But as their conversation escalated, the words became clear. "I know what's going on," Victor said, his voice like ice. "What are you talking about?" Alden replied, his tone calm but guarded. "Don't play dumb with me," Victor snapped. "I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. Do you think I'm blind?" My blood ran cold. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to confront Alden. "Victor, you're imagining things," Alden said, his voice steadier than I thought possible. "There's nothing going on." "Don't lie to me," Victor roared, and the sound of something, perhaps glass, breaking followed. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I stepped into the doorway, my hands shaking. "Victor, stop!" Both men turned to me, their expressions polar opposites. Victor's was a mixture of anger and betrayal, while Alden held something closer to defiance. "Melina," Victor said, his voice calmer now, but no less dangerous. "Tell me the truth. Is there something going on between the two of you?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My silence was answer enough. Victor laughed bitterly and ran a hand through his thinning hair. I knew it, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew it. Victor, please, I began, moving closer. Don't, he snapped, holding up a hand, and don't try to explain. There's nothing you can say that will make this right. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Victor turned to Alden, his eyes blazing. You're out, he said coldly. Pack your things and leave tonight. Alden stood his ground, his jaw tightening. I'm not going anywhere. Yes, you are, Victor shot back. You're not going to stay under my roof and disrespect me like this. I think you should calm down, Alden said, his tone low but firm. It only made Victor angrier. He stepped closer to Alden, his fists clenched at his sides. Don't tell me to calm down, you little... Stop it, I shouted, stepping between them. Both of you, just stop it. Victor turned to me, his eyes filled with pain. How could you, Melina? He asked, his voice breaking. After all I've done for you. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, tears streaming down my face. I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, he said bitterly. And now I have to deal with the fact that my own wife and son... He trailed off, shaking his head. I can't even say it. Alden reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't bear his touch. Not now, not with Victor watching. I think it's best if I go, I said quietly. Victor stared at me, his face hardening. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. This is my house. If anyone's going to leave, it's him. Victor, I started, but he cut me off. Number, I don't want to hear it, he said, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. You made your choice, Melina, and now you're going to live with the consequences. Alden left that night. He packed a bag without a word, his movements tense and mechanical. I followed him to the driveway, my heart breaking with every step. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He turned to me, his expression softer than I had expected. This isn't over, he said, his voice calm. You know that, right? I nodded, but said nothing, because as much as I wanted to believe him, I wasn't sure it was true. As his car disappeared down the road, I felt a pain deep in my chest, a mixture of guilt, loss, and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The days that followed were excruciating. Victor rarely spoke to me, his silence more punishing than any words could have been. I threw myself into housework, desperate to keep busy, but nothing could distract me from the emptiness I felt. Then, a week later, the letter arrived. It was from Alden. No return address, just my name in his familiar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I unfolded the paper. Melina, I know things are complicated right now, but I want you to know I meant what I said. This isn't over. I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. I can't just walk away from you. I won't. When you're ready, I'll be waiting. Always, A. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to tear it up, burn it, and pretend it never existed. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit, clung to his words like a lifeline. That night, I put the letter in the back of my dresser drawer, hiding it like a secret I wasn't ready to share with the world. Because deep down, I knew Alden was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.